Sophia Alderson had stopped wearing combat fatigues. She was in her room putting the finishing touches to her wedding dress. She had made it herself. It was made of wool. It made her itch terribly. She liked itching terribly. She thought it brought her closer to God. She looked in the mirror. She did her hair. Had Saint Doctor or Dr. St. Cunningham or Edgar Malroy been in the observation room that day, they would have been utterly lost for words. In the rose garden of Rainthorpe House, Pope Philip stood looking at his watch. Then he clapped his hands, and around the skinny pontiff rushed priests and choir boys, carrying giant candles and crucifixes. Sophia Alderson was about to be made a full-blown Carmelite nun. Her parents stood just inside the rose garden holding hands. They had been flown in for the occasion from Sicily, where Sophia's father had become a very successful insurance man. Outside the rose garden, some 2,000 heavily armed followers of Sophia Alderson came patiently waiting to witness stood patiently waiting to witness their spiritual leader become a fully fledged nun. It was a very moving time for them. Many were crying like Billy-O already. Behind the crowds of adoring followers, under a willow tree, was Pope Philip's piano, which had been flown in for the occasion from South America. Pope Philip's piano was being lovingly cleaned by one of Sophia's followers. Next to the piano was a very long table covered with thousands of glasses full of carrot juice. After taking one last look at herself in the mirror, Sophia Alderson lowered her veil and received her very last visitation from the Virgin Mary, who was dressed as a traffic warden. When Mary had gone, Sophia jumped into her wheelbarrow and was pushed out of her room by a nodding follower and gently bounced down the stairs. Her perfect bosom was undulating wonderfully. Written on the Virgin Mary's placard was the very last message Sophia Alderson would ever receive from the Mother of Jesus. It went like this: "You look like $1 million, kid." When Sophia Alderson rolled into the sunlight, 1,000 hearts were broken, and there was a collective sigh, as you might have expected. For Sophia Alderson was as beautiful as the Tarantula Nebula seen in infrared. She was as beautiful as the stagnant pool out of which life arose. She was as beautiful as all of George Mills Jr.'s wives put together. She was as beautiful can be. Pope Philip looked at his watch again and said they really ought to get started. Sophia took the Pope's hand as he led her over to the gaggle of priests at one end of the rose garden. The massive candles were lit, and hundreds of Sophia's followers bit their lower lips. Pope Philip told Sophia to kneel. She did so in her wheelbarrow as elegantly as one can be, and then placed her hands together in prayer. Sophia's father took a series of photographs. Later he would discover that he had failed to put any film in the camera. He would be distraught. Pope Philip coughed and then began to cross himself. It was then that Dr. Saint, or Saint Dr. Cunningham, riding a bicycle like a man possessed, pedalled into the grounds of Rainthorpe House, shouting for everyone to stop what they were doing. Behind Dr. Saint, or Saint Dr. Cunningham, were 4 police cars, their lights flashing. When they saw the thousands of heavily armed followers of Sophia Alderson standing there, the police sat in their cars and called for backup. Dr. Saint, or Saint Dr. Cunningham, pedalled right into the rose garden, and then took a few minutes catching his breath. All he could think to say was how beautiful Sophia looked. Pope Philip, greatly put out, looked at his watch again. Sophia stood up in her wheelbarrow. "This is truly a miracle! Saint Cunningham! God has seen to it that you are to be present at my wedding to his one and only begotten Son. We must pray in thanks. We will pray together." "There isn't time, Sophia," Dr. Saint, or Saint Dr. Cunningham, said desperately, looking for something to tick. "I agree," said Pope Philip. "Sophia, I have come to ask you to do something." said Dr. Saint, or Saint Dr. Cunningham, still a little out of breath.
After I have been joined in holy matrimony with Christ.
No, it can't wait. You have to do it now. Everyone then heard the thump noise of a helicopter. Part 2, Chapter 46.
Listen to me. God wants you all to turn around and put your fingers in your ears. Wait, before you put your fingers in your ears, let me tell you that God also wants you to count very slowly to 1,000 out loud. God has also made it very clear to me that whatever happens, you have to keep your backs turned and keep counting. It is God's will. Who are you to argue with God? Okay, now turn around. Yes, you too, Mother.
Sophia turned off her loudspeaker system.
Now, what was all that in aid of?
She asked Dr. Saint, or Saint Dr. Cunningham. Who knows, he said. Pope Phillips demanded to know what was going on. Then the Scepticism Inc. helicopter landed in the centre of the rose garden. Petals flew everywhere. Sophia's wedding dress billowed like crazy and all the giant candles were blown out. Edgar stepped rather nervously out of the helicopter. Sophia fell out of her wheelbarrow. Dr. Saint, or Saint Dr. Cunningham, scooped her up. None of Sophia's followers moved. Edgar waved shyly at Sophia, said hi, and then with the help of the pilot, who was chewing gum, removed me from the helicopter. Pope Phillips reached for an assault rifle, thanked God for his good fortune, and levelled it at Edgar. I told the Pope that there was no need to shoot Edgar, as he was surrendering unconditionally. Edgar didn't raise a whimper in protest. He hadn't heard me. He was still waving at Sophia. The Pope stopped pointing the gun at Edgar Malroy and turned it instead on Edgar's pilot. Pope Phillips demanded to know if the pilot was chewing Pope gum. The pilot swore that it wasn't Pope gum, but Pope Phillips wasn't satisfied until he'd been shown the screwed-up wrapper. Sophia and Edgar kept on looking at each other. Sophia's followers, their backs turned, kept on counting. They'd got to 68. They'd got to 68.
Say something to her,
I whispered into Edgar's ear.
What?
Edgar said. Pope Phillips put down the gun, turned back to Sophia, and clapped his hands. Sophia knelt down again in her wheelbarrow in front of the Pope, every now and again, though she kept glancing back at Edgar. The giant candles were lit again, and the Pope again made the sign of the cross. It was then that the Pope-mobile smashed its way through the police cars that blocked the entrance to Rainthorpe House and swerved into the rose garden, running over the feet of two of Pope Philip's priests and dousing everyone in holy water. The holy water put out the holy candles, and Sophia's wedding dress was ruined. Edgar told me that she looked even more beautiful soaked. She did. Her impossibly long eyelashes looked like saw blades. Although they were being doused in holy water, Sophia Alderson's faithful followers continued counting. Their backs turned, their fingers in their ears. They had got to 123. The cockpit of the Pope-mobile opened and, undoing his World War I flying helmet, Pope Thankyi, the former 16th Dalai Lama, leapt to the ground. Pope Phillips picked up his gun and pointed it at the other Pope and started shouting about how he was doing the ceremony and no one else, and how he would have it wrapped up hours. He would have had it wrapped up hours ago if he wasn't being constantly interrupted. He also told the former Dalai Lama to turn the damn sprinklers off. Pope Thankyi said he didn't know how to turn his holy water sprinklers off. He was new at the controls. Then Pope Thankyi asked if he had heard the news yet. Another general council had been summoned near Sebastopol. The General Council had 10 minutes ago excommunicated all of the popes and elected a new one. The General Council had elected Sophia Alderson as Pope. "I don't believe you," said Pope Phillips. Pope Blanky said it was true. "Would a pope lie, please?" Sophia didn't pay any attention to what the other two popes were saying. She was staring at Edgar. Pope Phillips refused to believe Pope Blanky and insisted on continuing with the ceremony. Pope Blanky said that it was necessary to postpone the ceremony. He had two reasons for this. One was a matter of theology. Could a pope also be a nun? The second reason was that he really had to discuss urgently with Pope Alderson the possibility of ending the Second Great Schism. Pope Phillips was having none of it. He said that Pope Blanky would just have to wait until after she had been married to Christ. Pope Blanky threatened to excommunicate Pope Phillips again. Pope Phillips threatened him back. I pushed Edgar forward. "Say something to her," I whispered. "Don't rush me," Edgar said. Sophia knelt down in her wheelbarrow, completely drenched in holy water. The wetter she got, the more beautiful she became. Her angelic nipples began to show through her wedding dress. A priest started trying to light the giant candles, but Pope Phillips told him to forget it. Pope Phillips then crossed himself and began marrying Sophia Alderson to Jesus H. Christ of no fixed abode. Edgar just stood there and told me how beautiful she looked. Sophia's followers got to 250. Part 2, Chapter 47. Sophia Alderson's followers got to 500. Pope Phillips got to the bit where Sophia was supposed to say, "I do," to a man who had died more than 2 millennia ago. It was at that moment that Edgar's watch started to beep for the very last time. This is what was on the liquid crystal display. "You are about to die." At the same moment, the Pope Mobile's holy water tanks ran out of holy water, and it stopped raining. Edgar leapt into the space next to Sophia Alderson, the space supposedly occupied by an invisible Jesus Christ. Edgar said that he had something to tell Sophia, and pushed her off to the other side, at the other end of the rose garden, holy water spilling over the sides of her wheelbarrow. Pope Philip stood there for a while, then looked at his watch and said, "That's it, I give up," and pushed his way through the followers of Sophia Alderson, making his way slowly to his piano that rested under the willow tree. It was nearly 4:30 in the afternoon. It was a beautiful sunny day. Pope Phillips had got about halfway to his piano when through the gates of Rainthorpe House sped a security van. The security van was going far too fast. It careered out of control and smashed into first Pope Philip's piano and then the willow tree. As it disintegrated, the piano made a most horrendous noise. Sophia's followers, who had counted up to 635, didn't bat an eyelid. The willow tree swayed to and fro for a while, then crashed down onto the security van. Glasses of carrot juice went everywhere. Pope Philip sank to his knees in disbelief. The driver's door of the security van opened, and out climbed the former Archbishop of Canterbury and Primate of all England, pushing aside the branches of the willow tree. He walked a short distance to Pope Phillips. He patted Pope Phillips on the back. Pope Phillips, still kneeling, his head cast to the ground, grunted. The former Archbishop then pushed his way through the crowd of Sophia Alderson's followers and greeted Dr. Saint, or Saint Dr. Cunningham, Pope Thankey, and myself. The girls at Sceptic Tower had told the former Archbishop where Edgar was to be found. The former head of the Church of England wanted to make just one more metaphysical bet. He wanted Edgar to take the bet personally. I don't know what Edgar said to Sophia Alderson before he told her the joke, but both of them were laughing and smiling as he pushed her wheelbarrow around the various rose beds. You wouldn't have been able to tell just by looking at the two of them that one was a nut and the other a nihilist evangelist, that the two of them disagreed fundamentally about everything. They just looked like a short man with a limp pushing a very, very beautiful woman in a wheelbarrow around a rose garden in the grounds of a mental asylum that had been turned into the headquarters of a religious movement. This is what happened next. A bee began circling Edgar. Edgar shooed it away with his good arm. The bee then started to bother Sophia. The bee circled Sophia's utterly beautiful, perfect little head. On the third lap, as Sophia's followers reached 867, the bee flew into Sophia Alderson's pretty little mouth. It really did. Sophia Alderson's pretty little mouth was open because she was laughing at the joke Edgar had just told her. It was the first joke I ever heard. It was about wheelbarrows. Sophia stopped laughing. Edgar asked what was wrong. He thought that she was having a visitation or something. The bee buzzed its way down Sophia's pretty little throat. Sophia gripped Edgar's hand as she felt the little bee buzz further and further into her. The bee reached Sophia's beautiful little stomach and died almost instantly, but not before it had stung Sophia in her windpipe. Sophia really stopped laughing and died of suffocation in Edgar's arms, her face the colour of a blackberry. Sophia Alderson believed that the whole universe was built to a most wondrous plan, and that everything that happened with a purpose. Aloha.